Joining us now on the Deseret First Credit Union hotline is Ben Kercheval of CBSSports.com. He is the reason we are discussing things like Cinderella and Belle and the greatest Disney princess, and if BYU really likes the designation of being considered a Cinderella team. Ben, welcome to the show.
How's it going, guys?
Fantastic. You know how BYU fans are. I'm sure your Twitter account got lit up by Cougar faithful when you listed BYU as one of 5 potential teams to make a Cinderella run next year. Why do you feel like BYU deserves that distinction? Because it seems like they're in that conversation quite a bit, Ben.
Yeah, they are, and it starts really to me with the marquee games. And right now in college football, if you're outside the Power Five, your access to the playoff is almost nothing. And it's just not a system designed to spread the love in the way that a tournament for college basketball is. So you have to do your damage more in the regular season. And so when you think of a Cinderella-type run, you almost have to sort of revision the way that it works in college football. And so for a BYU that's not quite Power Five, but they seem like they're above Group of Five a little bit, they're kind of there in limbo, I think scheduling matters. And there's a really great way to start the season for them, getting LSU at neutral site, and you get Utah, you get Wisconsin at home, and you look through those first 8 games. You go to Mississippi State, you have to play Boise State. There are a lot of opportunities for BYU to get people to notice them in that type of conversation really quick.
Now, with that type of schedule, is there room for a loss for BYU to still have a magical Cinderella story?
One loss is probably about the best that you can do. And when we always talk about teams outside that immediate playoff discussion in terms of where their margin of error is, ideally you need to go undefeated just to be realistically included. One loss you might be able to get away with if the rest of the top of the landscape is bad. Like if you're talking about 3-loss Big Ten champions, 2 or 3-loss Big 12 champions, 2-loss SEC, like you need other factors to play into that. But one loss that's the limit right there, I would say, for BYU.
Ben, in your piece, you said BYU may personify the term Cinderella best. What do you mean by that? Is it what you were talking about, that they aren't in a P5 conference?
That's part of it. Also, historically, I feel like they've been that type of program that acts and behaves like a Power 5 team, but doesn't always necessarily have that label to them. You go back to the 80s when they won national championship. You go back just a few years ago when they defeat Oklahoma in the first week of the season. BYU's really been one of those historic programs who it's not just a recent thing. It's something that they've done throughout their history where even though they aren't in the Big Ten, they're not in the Pac-12, they're not in the Big 12, they have stepped up to those types of games and been able to perform.
What do you like most about what BYU brings back this season in terms of talent on the actual football field?
Well, it starts at quarterback. You have an experienced guy with Tanner, and he's done a lot of great things in the time that he's filled in for Taysom Hill. And so now for him being clear-cut number one, anytime you have a good quarterback like that, that's a great place to start. Overall, you're talking about a pretty seasoned group. The 2 things that I think they need to figure out, you got to find the production in the running game, and then I think you got to find that on the other side along your D-line and with your pass rush. That's going to be pretty critical for them to find out and quickly, because it's not like you get a lot of warm-ups before you play LSU, before you have to then go through that 3-game stretch. So these are things that if you're really going to make that type of run, it can't be something that you figure out in week 7 or week 8.
Also in your top 5, besides BYU, you have Kansas State that you mentioned, South Florida, Syracuse, and then Mississippi State. And BYU hosted Mississippi State this year. They beat the Bulldogs. They will travel to Starkville, Mississippi to take on Mississippi State this year. What do you like about the Bulldogs?
So when we talk about Cinderella, there is a bit of a moving goalpost theme to the whole thing. So BYU and what they can realistically achieve may not necessarily be the same criteria with Syracuse. But the idea, again, is that you can do some things in the regular season to really get yourself noticed. And I think Mississippi State falls in line with that with the SEC West. my gut feeling is that the Bulldogs are probably a year away from having that 2014 type of season where you go off and you win 10 games, you're number one for a little bit. But I think with Nick Fitzgerald, he showed some inconsistencies last year, but also I think a lot of promise. And he's a really great young talent. I think they have some skill guys around him. So to me, Mississippi State, not necessarily a 10-win team per se in 2017, but I think they turn it around by about 3 games. And I think part of that is knocking off a team or so that they shouldn't.
Obviously, the Cinderella story would get ramped up considerably if BYU can start, and this is an enormous if, 4-0. Okay, Portland State is a gimme game. BYU should win that. I think they will win that 100%. But then it's LSU neutral, Utah at home, and Wisconsin at home. Okay, so let's take away the blue goggles for BYU fans. What do you think will actually transpire in those first 4, Ben? What do you see happening for BYU football?
Realistically, you're probably 2-2. LSU is just going to be tough. Utah, that you guys know how that is. That does not matter where it is, when it's played. That's a battle. And then Wisconsin is just a really tough physical opponent. I mean, you get them at home, which is an advantage, but that's just from the matchup standpoint, they have the guys in the trenches to knock you around. Realistically, you probably go 2-2. I think a really good outcome out of that is you go 3-1 and you get that win versus LSU. And if you really are going to make that type of Cinderella run, that's probably you can only drop 1 in there, and then you probably got to win out the rest of the way.
Yeah, and that one game, if BYU did lose it, it would have to be early, right? Just because you need time to win a bunch of games in a row.
Right. In theory, the playoff selection committee tells us the entire body of work is important. Clearly, how you do late in the season is a big part of it as well. Now, I'll say this for the middle of the schedule. You go to Mississippi State, and then you go to East Carolina. That's like, to me, that's an NBA back-to-back almost.
Oh.
Because because you have to go east twice against really good opponents. That's why I say, realistically, you might win against like an LSU. It really wouldn't surprise me if you dropped one or both of those games just because what they're asking you to do is so difficult.
Yeah, the travel alone, having to go to Starkville and then travel back to Provo and go back across the country to East Carolina is pretty crazy. Ben, great stuff thus far. For BYU fans that are a little bit skeptical about the Cougars and they don't like expectations and things like that, why is an article like this something that is necessary for the overall good of college football?
Because it's the off season and everyone's 0-0. This is when we can talk about it, right? We can't if BYU goes 5-3 through those first 8 games, no one's talking about it then because it's not part of the conversation. The playoff, think about how dramatically the playoff has shifted the conversation in college football. Once you get to about mid-October, you're talking about 8 teams and everything else is practically irrelevant. So now's the time where you can do this. At the beginning of the year, we're not unlike anyone else. We do here are the teams that can actually make a playoff run. Dennis Dodd did for us last season. There were 16 teams. You really think 16 teams have a chance to win a national title? No, it's probably about 6. But that's the time when you can do it. So I say have some fun with it. And someone's writing a good thing about you in the offseason. I say bask in it for a little bit.
Amen to that. Ben, great to talk to you. We appreciate the time, and we look forward to hopefully a Cinderella run for BYU.
All right, we'll be keeping tabs on it.
You got it. Ben Kercheval of CBSSports.com on the Deseret First Credit Union Hotline. Deseret First, your values, your timeline, your financial future.